his request for 2024, he's asking for an additional $273 million, which would go towards efficiency standards and certain things like that to help these railways just improve their own response.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking in their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Energy and Environment reporter Breanne Deppisch. Breanne, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he's been dealing with sort of environmental fallout and sort of political fallout of the Ohio train derailment, had recent testimony in Capitol Hill. Have we sort of seen any progress in terms of improved perception of the federal response, or?
I guess that depends on where you're sitting, right? So there has been bipartisan, yeah, good to know. There has been bipartisan legislation introduced to help kind of increase the safety for railroads. That was introduced by Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance, the two Ohio senators. And so there have been calls for more efforts like that. Today's hearing was mostly focused on the Department of Transportation's response, which has been widely panned from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Pete Buttigieg in particular was criticized for not responding quickly enough, and just really a response that was ineffective. Since this was a budget hearing, he kind of outlined various steps that the department has taken thus far to help address rail safety. In his request for 2024, he's asking for an additional $273 million, which would go towards efficiency standards and certain things like that to help these railways just improve their own response and they're called wayside detectors, which basically alert freights if there is an issue, like happened in East Palestine. He also noted that to date this year, the Department of Transportation has allocated $18 billion to, which is, not a insubstantial amount of money.
Not a trivial number, right?
Yeah, exactly. To just various things with the federal rail system, including helping build out and develop 70 critical infrastructure projects for rails across the nation. So he did respond to several of these things, and he seemed to signal support for the legislation introduced by Sherrod Brown and J.D. Vance, which would certainly be a step in the right direction. This was something that Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw declined to endorse just about a month ago. And,
obviously Pete Buttigieg agreeing with Sherrod Brown, the Democratic senator from Ohio, is not particularly noteworthy, but yes. it is an interesting coalition of sorts to have Buttigieg aligned with new Republican Senator J.D. Vance, who's considered a sort of an up-and-coming populist conservative. Trump supported him in the primary. He's in turn supporting Trump in the 2024 primaries. That's kind of an interesting development, no?
Yeah, and so even Pete Buttigieg's testimony in and of itself really indicated the growing bipartisan support behind rail safety. East Palestine, that derailment was really just sort of a wake-up call for a lot of issues that have been plaguing the industry for years. So I think, the testimony and the questions that Buttigieg faced from both sides of the aisle were pretty fair. It wasn't an acrimonious hearing. It is a little interesting. You mentioned J.D. Vance. He has taken aim specifically at Buttigieg, especially following the derailment, and sort of pilloried his lack of response. So it is interesting to see them potentially joining hands here.
Right, and there has been some talk of, because this is a relatively Republican area, there has been that scrutiny of the Democratic administration's response on that front.
Yes, and he did speak specifically to that. He said more oversight and kind of more regulations are needed, especially in rural areas, which do have the tendency to be overlooked, I think, more so than larger areas.
So switching to another form of transportation besides trains, the hope has been that electric vehicles, as a more environmentally sustainable form of automotive transportation, would be a moneymaker in the future, and perhaps that's the case. But some fairly established automakers are finding that
Mm-hmm.
isn't true right this second.
Yes, one in particular, Ford Motor, many of you have heard of it,
Right.
announced...
not a new startup.
Not a new startup, certainly, announced that it expects to lose, $3 billion in 2023 alone. This is a pretty significant, just in its EV market alone, I should say. Mm-hmm. It has three kind of main areas: the traditional gas-powered vehicles, the electric vehicles, and its sort of commercial sector. That is a not insignificant development. Mm-hmm. It did say that it remains on track to meet its larger target of by 2026, and it really attributed the decline in just all the investments that it's been making in battery plants in several U.S. states. Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of, and I think probably it might be the writing on the wall for other EV companies as they look to expand their production in the U.S. and comply with certain stipulations on sourcing and production included in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Obviously, mm-hmm. EVs are a pretty big part of the Biden climate agenda. Mm-hmm. They're a pretty big part of what they're trying to promote with the Inflation Reduction Act. Mm-hmm. So does this cause any longer-term concerns about those goals?
I think it's pretty early to say. We've seen some sort of positive developments in terms of the U.S.-EU tensions. They seem to have abated following the head of the EU Commission's trip to the White House to visit with Biden. There seems to be some sort of development there in terms of working together versus against each other. The EU had come out with accusations of violations of the World Trade Agreement, and introducing all these things. But I think, in terms of individual automakers, it's probably a little early to say. I think the coming months will be really telling.
So finally, save the whales has always been a very big environmentalist, conservationist mm-hmm. slogan, a rallying cry. Mm-hmm. You've written a whale of a tale, I understand. Talk a little bit about what this latest controversy is.
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned Save the Whales because, they're famously very big conservation group. Mm-hmm. I think some people associate it with more progressive movements, but they actually came out pretty strongly endorsing Republican efforts, which have really sought to called for an immediate, just urgent halt to offshore wind activity, at least for the time being, not forever, but just mm-hmm. for now, in the Northeast, specifically around New Jersey, where there has been a spate of not only whale deaths, but also dolphin deaths increasingly. Mm-hmm. Recently, there was a pod of 8 dolphins that washed up on the shores of New Jersey. They died within hours. Several other incidents have been reported. And since early December, I believe 23 whales, including endangered right whales and humpback whales, have washed up on shores. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, so in response, a coalition of Republican lawmakers has called on NOAA to halt the action, called on Governor Chris Murphy to halt the offshore wind until just more studies can be done. And one thing I want to point out before we run out of time mm-hmm. is that at a hearing last week in South Jersey, a climate activist in the region noted that actually, a lot of these have been blamed on increased vessel activity, sure. shipping, things like that. Mm-hmm. But actually, since December, when the whale deaths started, there's been a 20% decrease in sort of this large commercial scale shipping. Mm-hmm. And this is when the offshore wind sort of pre-testing, the sonar testing started. So there seems to be an interesting correlation there. Remains to be seen whether the Biden administration will heed any of these calls, mm-hmm. but certainly something to keep our eyes on.
Is it a little bit of tension then between two sort of environmental goals? Obviously wind energy is one, but preserving various endangered species and other wildlife is another?
It is, and actually a lot of these groups and even the lawmakers have said they're certainly not opposed to offshore wind. They just mm-hmm. want to make sure it's done in a way that protects the marine mammals and is not damaging the area in such a way that can't be reversed or causes long-term damage.
Right, it would be the opposite of what they're trying to accomplish.
Exactly.
Thank you, Breanne.
Thank you.
You can read Breanne and subscribe to our Daily on Energy newsletter at washingtonexaminer.com.